Hello everyone, today we complete the third and last episode of the exchange I've had on Schwerpunkt's email with a follower keenly interested in matters of ethnicity in Antiquity mostly, but also the Middle Ages. So I simply read the question the question and answer series. If fans follow up Ethnos in Antiquity on the dichotomy of barbarians and civilization. First of all, I wanted to reiterate that I thoroughly enjoyed this exchange. These are the kind of questions that work best for the Q&A. I think that overall, like this bedrock of sort of solid historical awareness coupled with specific curiosities and need to sort of wanted to look into some details, some specific niches of pretty big questions, as a matter of fact, can be really educational. And I totally understand where the person comes from with this, because when I was younger, his age, I was exactly in the same way, and we all learned through this kind of approach, right? So I simply read, Dear Schwerpunkt, I give you high praise for your reply to my tedious questions. As I stated in my previous message, your response to my prompts make me feel as though I'm able to breathe for the first time. Before I go on to ask any further questions, I shall indulge you in my personal and academic background, for which you seem to exhibit a degree of curiosity. Yes, because given the thorough inquiry and again the systemic knowledge possessed by the author, I really started to wonder. I said it in the previous videos, like, why exactly these questions were, what was the background, etc. So he continues, it says, you may choose to include or disregard this section in your reply if you find it irrelevant. Only please keep my name anonymous. Sure, I will read it. The names are always anonymous unless probably there isn't some specific reason and permission. I personally think the background is interesting also for the other users, because it can better explain, in fact, how, and this is in fact some of the most fascinating aspect of the world, is how certain backgrounds bring to certain historical curiosity. And this always happens, because in many ways I always say that hearing how a person talks history is somehow the easiest way to get, especially to his political vision, right? And admittedly, when things are more complex, like it seems like it's a bit more complicated, in fact, to sort them out. And here we have at least an example, which is also fairly, again, peculiar one. So he says, I first disclosed to you in my very first Q&A on Greco-Slavic civilization that I am actually Asian American. More specifically, I am descended from an ethnic minority known as the Hmong. We are a nation with no state. My father and grandfather aided the United States in their struggle against communism in Southeast Asia, Laos. Due to our association with the United States, the Laotian Communist Party carried out an ethnic cleansing against the Hmong after US support withdrew. I was born in the United States, to which I balance both a Hmong and American identity. I'm also quite ardently a Protestant Christian. As such, you can see how this plays into the nature of my questions. It gave me a good laugh when you thought I was Hungarian. Yes, because you started talking about, example, you could be a neighbor of Hungary or Hungarian yourself, given sort of the thorough, I don't remember exactly what sparked that statement, but if you go back into the video, I explained that, and I was just suspicious. He says, although you weren't completely off the mark, well, I already know what he wrote, like a little bit, I would say, because after all, there is a possibility that the Magyars may have initially been a Mongoloid population. At least these are the kind of questions that would bring to new, world wars and people tearing each other apart, especially on YouTube comment sections, etc. You always have to appreciate, of course, the formally, officially, say, Ugrian narrative to the origin of the Magyars. But I understand that this is somehow intended lightheartedly. So at the end of your video, you seem to wonder why I came to you with these questions despite my valid analysis. Firstly, I have no formal education in history. All the knowledge I have expressed to you was accumulated at my leisure. Well, congratulations for that, because it's fundamentally very good, right? So that's why I was, and it is very good foundationally. If you had, say, for example, understood like maybe a topic, but probably a theme separated from another, like, I don't know, about making an example about China as opposed to India, right? Things like that. It's easy to say, okay, this guy studied more China as opposed to India, etc. But you have like a pretty widespread sort of, and not even just elementary or even just school level of historical awareness. It's just like when it comes to the political, ethnic, linguistic, identity, mostly identitary package that, although understanding that in part very well, again, at a pretty advanced level, there is something that you seem to specifically focus on that it's as if you didn't want to make it sound correct, because you have all the pieces. You lay them out yourself explicitly. So I'm just at times even just using your own same points to drive my own. So he continues and says, essentially, I'm a parallel to one of those Facebook historians you complain about. Yeah, all right. We'll pass through that. I'm actually enrolled in the medical field. That is very good. Which is the US exposes me to even more foreign people. Admittedly, I should have spent more time studying medicine than enjoying a good history book. Well, I'll never say that. I would say that, actually. It's a pretty good choice anyway, but this depends, of course, on how much medicine you have actually studied. Secondly, no pop historian I have found discusses these ethnic matters in a direct, detailed, and digestible manner as you have. This is true. I can't think of anyone unless like in the bigger sort of channels there is some kind of reference to that. But let's say finding the time just to, like, I try to make this like sitting at a table and properly taking the time of explaining even this shades, this perspectives is not much out there, because either again there is something pre-cooked that is just like we know what we're talking about, or especially the ethnic identity topic seems to be somehow too critical for people in general to accept, like without further debating, which also may create some malaise or whatever. But on Schwerpunkt we've always been about this, and I must say that people always had a good response from that, because I talk all peoples or countries, especially in Europe, and I've never really had like somebody coming at me and say, oh my god, this is all wrong, you get it badly, I hate you, whatever. Of course, I learned a bit over the years to address these topics as well. I have made also, really many unnecessary mistakes over the years, but overall, I also draw my information from some kind of, not just my formal training, but having taken my time to reflect on this stuff over the years, which is something that I know my own colleagues do not do. And that's why Schwerpunkt to me is my own incredibly precious resource of information, because without this thinking, I wouldn't really be able to have the even just the capacity to explain something to a satisfactory level. And here he continues, it says, this is due to the controversy of racial nationalism. Well, yeah, in part, and is further diminished by a scarcity of medieval sources. Sure. Any attempt to conceptualize how a medieval peasant truly understood their nationality cannot be known, thus it's preferable to ignore the questions I pose. Yeah, somehow, but it's also, it's not much a matter of historiographical or national self-referentiality. I would say we overall know what these identities kind of were. It's just that you're right. When it takes the time like to confront these processes, when mostly this is mostly what I noticed through over the years on Schwerpunkt, that people are interesting in comparisons, in a diachronic perspective as well. even though it's painful to hear, because it's as if like you're, as I often discuss, like pointing out like differences in civilizational development, etc. And different peoples, of course, perform better, worse, and or with different outcomes that can't quite be more than denied. Like you can't be simply sugar-coated sometimes in ways that are, at the end of the day, the reality in which we live in any case. Thirdly, he says, your channel serves as a direct line of communication which provides me with convenience. Which is, sure, what I'm mostly doing here. With this all being said, I shall now proceed to my final question regarding ethnic identity in Antiquity and the Middle Ages. There appears to be a dichotomy between the barbarian and civilization, the conquered and the conqueror. The cycle goes like this: a vibrant civilization is initiated by an ethnic core which soars to great heights. Its prosperity attracts barbarians, which eventually supplants civilization. But the barbarians, despite having conquered, quote-unquote, civilization, adopt the identity of those they rule over. What is it that compels the barbarian to inherit civilization? What is the place of ethnic identity in the wake of this cultural transition? This cycle shows itself through. So here there is the list. I think if you have followed this kind of videos, you know that he makes this kind of series, etc. Just to preemptively respond to this question, the questions we just read. What compels the barbarian to inherit civilization is mostly whether that is actually a better option than not having it, right? And it's not much a matter of personal opinion. As you know, I'm not a culturalist. I think civilization has a universal value. And you can easily see how after, say, moments of relative chaos or destruction, of course, that derive mostly from political infighting, also within the same conquerors at some point, or reasons of deterrence, like razing to the ground Corinth or Carthage, like the Romans did, or stuff like that. There is always a pretty strong awareness of the advantage of inheriting, depending what. Like in this case, Rome was actually basically becoming more advanced than even the most advanced of the subjects. So the question is different. There are cases which the bigger the civilization conquers the barbarian, which is also in fact the other side of the coin, where the barbarian gets sort of civilized, and tendentially you have that mostly prevailing through history. As far as what is the place of ethnic identity in the wake of this cultural transition, well, we'll just see now from the questions. The first one, Babylon, parentheses, Akkadians, Amorites, Guthians, Chaldeans, Kassites, etc. Like the Romans, there seems to have been a period where the city eventually transcended into a broader ethnos. The Akkadians and Amorites also seem to parallel the Latins and Germans who blended themselves into a single people. Here, because there's the Latin question later, so I will not digress much in the former, but I would like just to point out that, as I also understand why from the later question, rather than Latins, we should be talking of italics. Because otherwise it's just, Latins is just like to say Dingaevones for the Germans, right? It's mostly like here regional national peoples of some sort. And here you can understand also the parallelism, especially with the city, as far as Rome, the Latin city-states were concerned. I would also like to point out, of course, that Mesopotamian civilization is something which starts properly at the beginning of what we conventionally call history through the coagulation of these early national backgrounds. When you look at Mesopotamia, you can't even specifically talk of a nationality per se. We talk about Semitic peoples with Indo-European infiltrations, but we hardly think of Babylonia simply as a people, right? Even though today we have the Iraqis and there is, of course, a Mesopotamian continuity, in fact, in what is mostly today Iraq, etc., it's difficult to speak of a specific nation for the time. This is sort of strange because as we will have the way to discuss today, Persia is intended in very different ways. Even other boundaries, like the Syrians, for example, are also sort of more easily outlined. I would say that, yes, maybe also what would eventually become Iraq, geographically speaking, does maintain a great deal, probably the longest continuity in history, but it's less often considered in national terms than we conventionally do, and it would be a very interesting question to explore. In fact, in part, this is what the author does. Says Babylonia would manifest from this fusion as a pillar that absorbed every nation which passed through it. These various ethnic groups which assimilated into Babylon then raises the question, what did it mean to be a Babylonian? This city was inherited by foreigners who manifested its legendary status as the center of the world. Thus, one may posit that the Babylonian ethnos was somehow something more fluid. Or perhaps they were simply too few in number to displace the Babylonians, which is also often what happens. Still, it brings into question how important ethnic lineage was to the identities of a Babylonian citizen. Would a Kassite be considered Babylonian if they simply adopted their culture? Was there a more specific ethnic label they would have used, like the Latins as Romans? And as Babylonian history continued, knowing that outsiders had established different dynasties, how would the various waves of foreign migrations be perceived by their people, respectively? How would it play into the way they saw themselves under Persian and Greek rule, both of which broke the cycle of Babylonian assimilation? Why did Babylon fail to absorb the Persians and Greeks as opposed to those who came before them? So, as far as the identities and how, especially like the various waves of conquerors would have been perceived, also among one another, like we notoriously know very few about this. There is also a great deal of continuity. Given that it's early history, as I was saying, actually the continuity, for example, the models of power, including the imperial, the universal one, were pretty much similar. This is something you can easily see also among the Achaemenids, or even certain ways, even the Diadochoi represented themselves artistically wise, or even the Romans to some point, like it adopted from certain iconographic models and properly ways of seeing themselves. It's something which probably has, in fact, a universal key to it as well. As far as the fact that the Achaemenids and the Greeks did not, as well as later conquerors, which ties to what I was saying before regarding the fact that it's not really clear to identify as a sort of Babylonian nationality just per se, even though it existed, and especially during the Bronze Age, that sort of Semitic backbone. And some of these peoples were, as a matter of fact, from that same one in times in which, in fact, we're not even just looking at nations, other bulks of peoples that sort of simply took over and from another, also clearly or outlined or properly distantly and sort of parallel in importance ethnic background. The reason being definitely that Achaemenids and Macedonians came with a level of power that, in interest of territorial extension, had never been seen before, right? In other words, they were more powerful, and so they didn't stop to Babylonian. There had been other great civilizations around already that had detached from it, and so you can argue that while Mesopotamia had historically been the center of civilization, together with Egypt, but were distanced enough not to go along pretty detached, and or think about the Assyrian conquest of Egypt as like being something more decentralized and detached, where everybody realized who was who. They are differently from these other groups into Mesopotamia. In fact, you have by the time the Achaemenids, which weren't in fact the first Iranians that had entered Babylonia, so to say, and the Macedons, you have other peoples like, I don't know, the Armenians. You have the same even before the Achaemenids took over, but other neighbors. You have the Phoenicians. You have, again, other groups that can be considered at this point as sort of fully fledged nations separated from the Babylonian one, and in fact also in a geographical context that had not ever been reached by that overall Babylonian identity. That can sort of explain that. It's a sort of different intensity of power more than else. As far as the other considerations, would a Kassite, for example, be considered Babylonian if they simply adopted their culture? Substantially, yes. I wouldn't draw, because we'll see it's very particular, like the simple sort of aspect of Latins and Romans, but it depends to the degree of dilution, right? Because the Romans were actively colonizing to a level of demographic and military engineering that you do not really see among these other peoples, that, especially in Babylonia, are fundamentally city-states, right? So Babylonia could be, as one, the most important at the end of the day, but never exceeding becoming like a simpler molder of identities outside of itself, or better, it would surely engineer the overall identity of the region, but as essentially the expression of that same broader Semitic pool that more or less we intend to today's Iraq, where so many other city-states had emerged, right, risen and fallen, and of course increasingly solidifying some sort of regional ethnicity that you can even understand as national, until you realize that this part, like the oldest civilization in the world, was probably also so exhausted, cyclically speaking, by that early rise that in the rest of history you really have so many other takeovers that are sort of difficult to explain. By the way, that's an important crossroad of empires, of frontiers, and therefore it's not easy to maintain a local, such a precisely outlined identity locally. But this is also what you haven't really asked. 2. Egypt, Nubians, Assyrians, Greeks, etc. Egypt follows a similar trend like Babylon, but its identity as a nation is not limited to the city. Exactly. So the same question remains: how did Egypt manage to assimilate all those who passed through it? How integral was being of Egyptian descent to their rule? Well, culturally a lot, just given that we talk about identity, not necessarily of ethnicity, but you know that basically all the dynasties that came to rule Egypt, aside from the Romans, basically, so anybody would rule from Egypt at least, because also Roman art institution would undergo iconographically, for example, some important change, like Augustus represented like a pharaoh, but just in Egypt, right? In fact, continuing that tradition that was essentially an Egyptification of rulers. The Ptolemies were by far the most syncretic, for example, of the Diadochoi, as far as the local populations was concerned. This I see it due to the fact that Egypt was, let's say, easier to control historically compared to Mesopotamia by the locals, right? Because you have this Nile Valley that has an enormous amount of wealth along its banks that are also pretty small, like geographically. It's huge in length, and it's, of course, like an impressive system, but I mean, east and west, you have the desert pretty immediately next to it. So it was fairly easy to take over the valley and to take over these enormous resources. And so to centralize on the basis of not necessarily a city, but capable of sort of leading properly a regional control over a territory that was also very much interconnected, fairly isolated, because again, you have the desert in between, then you have the sea in the north, and in the east, there isn't much of another It's a fairly isolated country. It's very interconnected with the rest, but you don't have any major pool of sort of major endemic ethnicity sort of shattering things in the process. Mostly just the same way these locals had easily controlled Egypt, so invaders can easily control it even with a relatively minute military force, especially compared to the local demographics. Right? We talked partly this in the videos about the Ptolemaic army organization that takes into consideration, for example, the Catholic, like the Macedonian, and not only Macedonian, by the way, military colonies. Mesopotamia hadn't been like that, right? Because there were so many different centers, and there wasn't even along the Tigris and Euphrates that sort of, even just the fact that there are two rivers, even though they follow more or less the same valley practically, towards the area that was more, in fact, fertile, civilized, etc. Like there isn't. It's a more open system. Like it's more exposed. You have multiple centers that rise and fall at different times. So at that point, each one could boast, as a city-state, some kind of overlordship on the region that would strengthen in part the region as such culturally, but would also be more habituated to this kind of switch. Then continuing the question, how was the Egyptian ethnos impacted by the role of Roman citizenship? This is a very interesting question because say Egypt was never apparently very westernized story. I mean, it would actually be, when you look at especially medieval warfare, I always say that, for example, the Fatimids, the Ayyubids, etc., like the Mamluks were fighting with a form of state and army that was much more Western, right, much more European, Mediterranean than, say, the Central Asian influenced Turkic ones of Mesopotamia at that point. It had yet another foreign rule on it. Roman citizenship is difficult to assess in that regard because, as we will see later with the question on the Edict of Caracalla, is also a matter like who were the Romans at large by, say, the 3rd century AD. Egypt, Palestine, Syria, these were areas that really remained very, very exotic in Western terms. It's probably the deepest sense of the Roman background. As you know, this is true also during the Byzantine period, where the empire tries everything to maintain control of these Levantine provinces that are really going on their own, even though they had been part mostly of an Hellenistic koine, more than a Roman one, at least in the way it was probably felt by them, really. So there were many Romans, and surely by the time of the Islamic invasions in Egypt, you find people who identified as such. But let's not forget that when the Romans conquered these regions, and I made a video specifically about this, not just about Roman Egypt, but probably the eastern provinces at large, the Greeks, since the Macedonian conquest, had remained the master race. Just the Romans had superseded, and also just intending the Greeks as, because of the Alexandrine legacy, worthy subjects, of course. The native Egyptians, about which we know also rather few in this picture, because they remain more or less in the latifundia, just like they had always been from a pretty long time, literally millennia, were really something else, and they really were probably not even participating more than much other than in a communal fashion to the actual government, that of course had sort of ethnic Egyptians at some point, like reaching certain posts, etc., but was fundamentally in the hands of foreigners. Also, again, in a country that had an incredibly vertical hierarchy, so that there wasn't much contact even before, since the time of the early pharaohs, between these and the rest of the population at large. Then, under the Nubian dynasty of Egypt, heard that one that Upper Egypt was annexed peacefully while Lower Egypt was subjugated militarily. Not to mention, Nubia engaged with a great deal of trade and intermarriage with Egyptians. With this in mind, it seems to me that the Nubians were among the least foreign dynasty among all the outsiders to rule Egypt. Well, this depends, of course, of how you conceptualize the Nubians per se. Of course, there is a lot of commixtion there. The simple reason why that dynamic happened, of course, is that the north was more distant, and that, in spite of the aforementioned saying of mine that Egypt was easy to control. Of course, we're talking compared to other powers at the time, but at large, there were many different aristocrats who would rise and fall depending on the circumstances when there were these vacuums of powers. And of course, the Nubians had a greater sway in the south, just out of their provenance, all right? So the question is, how would the rule of the Nubians be perceived, especially in that of Upper Egypt? Why were the Nubians able to gain the legitimacy of Upper Egypt so easily, despite there were being previous wars among one another? This likely depends on the ways first of all, like the continuity in pharaonic sort of state, statal power was concerned, what kind of groups had been marginalized and which not, what kind of power sharing situations also after a power vacuum were concerned. Like you can't have foreigners, for example, stabilizing order, which is a huge deal. It often happens historically that you prefer actually to end up under somebody else as opposed to have this forever wars that really do not bring any stability, which at the day is unsustainable. So that's not very knowledgeable in that period just per se, but that seems sort of the obvious answer why Egypt went through that specific dynamic and also somehow came back to be more or less what had been before. Also the fact that at the end of the day, the center of power in Egypt shifted increasingly towards the north as Mediterranean civilizations were gaining prominence, and so at large, like also the control on the river mouth was becoming sort of ever more battled upon, so that you have in fact the lower part of the country not being so happy to be in the hands of the Nubians. 3. Rome, Greeks, Latins, Germans. In early Rome, not all Latins were Roman, but all Romans were Latin. This phrase is eventually reversed in the years of Rome's rise to empire. So between being a mere city and the heart of a universal order, how did Romanism maintain the Latins as the bedrock of its... So this is what I had already read the entire thing more or less cursorily. Now I connected better to the first reference to the Latins in the first question. So I think here there may be a misconceptualization. That is to say, the Latinity of the Romans does not exactly switch as the Romanity of the Latins, meaning the Latins were the population of the empire, all right? Not even those who actually spoke Latin. If you look at the Roman Empire, definitely were the Greeks Latin? No, right? They had a state that spoke Latin, kept even in later times Hellenized certain Latin terms that would remain in use in medieval times, but were, as I was just saying, the Egyptian ever Latin at some point, or were the Syrians ever Latin, or the even certain parts of even of continental Europe ever Latin. Not quite. You can argue that there is a pretty self-evident pattern that remained, by the way, more or less unaltered regarding the spread of Latinity that we must understand, however, at that point only from a linguistical point of view, right? In fact, the the answer continues with the adjective Caracalla, we will see. But basically, the countries that you see today as the bedrock of Romanity. Interestingly enough, even Gaul and Spain, or even the same Italy that were, even though with Latters we'll see now there is something more concrete, began to speak Latin properly as the local language over the Roman times, were not considered Latin. All right, Latin is mostly something that we intend today with incredibly varying shades, mostly stemming from a Germanic perspective in Europe, so that we can say Latinos, speaking of Latin Americans, basically. I often use the term Latin Europe for medieval times in general because I want exactly to stress that it was a part of Europe that not just was Romance, but also that maintained Latin at some sort of deeper level, for example, administration, etc. And also exactly to stress the fact that they weren't considering themselves Romans per se anymore, even though they would have actually and preferably at times called themselves like that, the Romanicians, like the Germanicians, were this terminology also towards the end of the empire. So this issue is complicated. If you know Roman history well, shouldn't really be difficult to be explained. But to make the long story short, at the end of the Roman Empire, the bedrock of Romanness was Romanness. All right, it wasn't any particularly specific ethnic reference. To who was an actual Roman, if not at that point in opposition to peoples that were outside of the Roman Empire, right? Think about Romania, which is a term that appears for the Balkans mostly, or like today's region of Romagna in Italy as opposed to the Lombardy, right? Even though in the latter the ethnic divide was practically non-existent. So as you understand, it is a bit complicated. I would argue this, on the contrary, that what had come the closest to an ethnic universal dominance, which had de facto existed up to the first centuries of the empire, was the Italicness of the empire. Right? There is no doubt that when we look at the Roman Empire, regardless of all the multiculturalistic notion that, everybody was different, everything was accepted, whatever, which is absolutely not what really the Roman Empire was about. The foundation of the empire was the conquest of the world by a specific nation, that is the one of the Italic people, right? That were essentially like the Romano-Italic Confederacy, that is literally the nation that lorded over the others, and that remained basically the center of the empire, with that very specific distinction and centrality of Italy, not of Latium per se, but Italy, because again, the Latins are just a part of the Italics, all right? That's what I was saying before regarding the Ingaivones for the Germans, for example. And that, in fact, was not even particularly considered. Of course, Latium was important because of the early history of Rome. The fact that, again, Latin was the language that eventually was spoken in the Roman administration, had managed to literally change the ethno-linguistic fabric of the major countries in the West, which is unique because the Romans had colonized and controlled and culturally hegemonized those countries at an important level. But it's not much like these guys were considering themselves as Latins, right? Also because being a Latin citizen was something very specific and separated from not just being a Roman citizen, but probably from, as you know, a matter of citizenship and an administrative one. There were some Roman citizens that had all the full rights of being a Roman citizen, but they had impoverished themselves that they preferred to obtain the Latin citizenship. because this had historically been provided by Rome after the conquest of Italy with some favoritism, mostly commercial advantages, etc. But the actual backbone of Romanity in that sense had been Italicness. And even though the Italics began to speak Latin, actually they spoke a language that was pretty much the same, right? Latin was just a provincial dialect of the Italic branch that was a very specific one within the Indo-European people, not to confuse with the Italian peoples, because say the Etruscans, even though today we're understanding that basically most of Italy was actually Italicized, was actually Indo-Europeanized to a great extent. There were some peoples that were not specifically Italic, right? So the difference between Roman, Latin, Italic, Italian is very straightforward, right? But also in this sense, like the power that was wielded in the empire. This Italic dimension, for some strange reason, has not been stressed enough, I think, in pop culture. Again, most people think it's not the first time, especially as you are an Asian American, but especially as an American, you have this notion, I've heard it other times, it's very apparently common in the United States that like the Italics are bypassed, right? The Romans were Latins, and so Italy was populated by the Latin peoples that more or less are the Latins, as we intend as this other diasporized or widespread type of almost ethnicity. Absolutely no, right? There is the main backbone of Romanity in its imperial essence is Italic, containing the Latinity, but the fact of beginning to speak Latin, especially the Roman way, the one of the city of Rome, as it was basically a very close language to theirs, right? It was basically the same one. It's like to say, I don't know, again, there was, and it's difficult because it was very specific, and Italy had a very old literacy, especially in Rome, that allowed for also the same Romanization of the peninsula. For these Italic peoples to basically seeing that Latin, basically a pretty understandable language, it was virtually their own, right? Oscan was the other major branch, aside from the Latino-Faliscans, but again, they're basically the same language. The etymologies are, so it's a very primitive, brutal Indo-European language, but in this sense, it was formed mostly in its complexity as a classical language through the civilization of the Romans. Well, in the moment in which Italy had become this robust confederacy that eventually took over the world, so that when look at the various Roman colonies in across, especially like the empire, but especially in Europe, you realize that most colonies are not actually Latin, if we want to split hair, but they're actually Italic, all right? In fact, specific characters of Romanian, of French, of Spanish, or Portuguese derive from the dialects that were spoken, especially in the Oscan part of Italy, right? And so the Latinity of it was just relegated to the official Latin that was spoken in Rome, which was akin to the Italic language, to the point that it served for their national identity. And even at that point, at the peak of the Roman Empire, Romanity was not Latinity, right? Ask an Idumean if it had anything to do with Latinity. Yes, they could speak Latin, but it's just like saying, I don't know, that in the British Empire, an Indian could speak English, right? It's not like those are, of course, it's a very different context, but you get what I'm talking about. And so this is also to answer, in fact, the rest of the question, because you say, what did it mean to be a Latin if anyone, though not without struggle, could be Roman, right? They wouldn't care, right? Because they didn't have to become Latin to be Roman, unless you define as a Latin anybody who can speak Latin, but that actually uses that as a foreign language that he uses in the administration of the hegemonic empire that has no connection with that world, just like, I don't know, an Indian had no connection with Kent or Sussex or whatever, you know what I mean? Was Latin identity, you ask, really phased out and supplanted by being Roman? Again, that is something that didn't even happen at the beginning of it, because the Latins considered themselves Latin, but as it often happens with this provincial identities in this case, in opposition to other peoples, right? And by that time, the various Latin city-states, including Rome, already existed, so that they had a great shared identity, but they were considering themselves a bit like within their own universe, so that when Rome eventually takes over the entire Latium and she starts fighting and conquering, etc., it's more like the Roman citizen aspect, those who had won the Roman citizenry within the same Latin reality dominated by Rome that was extended and became critically, like through the colonization and Roman expansion, the backbone of Roman identity, right? So yes, they would speak Latin, but in that sense, Latinity was superseded by Rome in archaic times pretty early as a broader political and, in that sense, metaphysical ethnic identity. So yes, Latin identity was really phased out and supplanted by being Roman, and if anything, I think it's easier for you to see this as it actually is. We may have somehow equivocated. I don't know, because I should reread, because you say at some point this changed, right? But it changed pretty early, all right? Even before Rome, came out of Latium. So in the moment in which Rome took over the world, so to say, there had never been a Latin identity that had superseded the one of being Roman. There was a Latin citizenship that was not the full Roman citizenship. At some point, there were all some sort of levels of citizenship. But that was not particularly associated properly with the empire in its expansion, right? So that there were Latin colonies, say, but the Roman ones, and also in fact the Roman citizens that had colonized also Italic lands, for example, or others, was standing. Everybody considered the Romans, not Latins, if not by the fact that they had emerged, they had sprang out of Latium, right? So you say, how ethnically conscious would the Latins have been in Italy and as colonists abroad? This is interesting. Probably they would have really been conscious of themselves. Like, again, the Latinity did remain within the Roman political system. It was, again, represented by the citizenship, which level that included some important favors. It's as if the Latins were a bit like the elected people that Rome, however, had tamed and had also wanted to demilitarize a bit because they didn't want to have troubles at home, by giving them sort of more commercial privileges, so that the Roman colonies were more military in nature, the Latin one more economic in nature. So in Italy and abroad, eventually these Latin colonies would be replicated, but eventually they were subsumed in the broader Roman citizenship that the same Latins had acquired for also reasons of political participation. Just think, even the Italics had fought, as you know, for that during the social war. So at large, say by the time of Augustus, being a Roman at large in Italy was about being Roman, not about being Latin. There was some snobbery about, for example, I know there were some Roman noblemen who claimed, such as Maecenas, for example, to be of Etruscan ancestry, even though it was likely not true, because the Etruscans had maintained an important feudal level where their elite was very elite. And so being Etruscan and coming, of course, from the elite at that point to be in those higher circles in Rome, meant to be so much more interesting and powerful, because of the idea also that the Romans had maintained mythologically of the Etruscan in her own culture, right? But here, also from the question, I understand that you shift the thing a bit more towards actually the later centuries. You say, after intermarrying for so many generations, would the descendants of Roman colonies felt any need to claim Latin identity? Again, this was not a thing, really. They were Roman, right? Anything, they were much more attached to their places of origin. It could be Latium, but it could be mostly like the places where the Romans had eventually like extended most of their citizenry to draw, especially for the military colonists from. So it could be from Picenum, from Campania, from Umbria, etc. Like so, we are plenty of this evidence. We know also often where Roman governors came from, etc., from Italy, and from this broader Italic identity that by that point had already become Roman at large, and especially in those positions of power. And so you ask, how was Latin identity impacted by the Edict of Caracalla? So again, I will answer this as if you really meant Latin identity as a linguistic one, not this Roman one, and probably, well, it was impacted in the sense that, as you know, in the edict, basically you were considered Roman if you could speak Latin, right? So if you had the basic rudiments to engage into the civic sort of administrative governmental system of Rome. In fact, there were so many people who actually fell out of that. We often think as if, the Edict of Caracalla, everybody within the Roman Empire was actually a Roman. Not really. It was plenty of people who, in the sense, fell out of that. Not just much because they were just immigrants, etc., but because they belonged to areas that had never really been Romanized to the point of having a basic rudiment of Latin, right? Again, for the Italics, relearning Latin was no problem. It was basically just a variant of their dialect, all right? And that's the national backbone that we're discussing. Then, number 4, China. Khitan, Turks, Manchu. The Turkic Orkhon inscriptions in a very detailed manner give warnings to the danger of assimilating into Chinese society. Rather than venerating the Chinese, it portrays them as a cultural poison that must be avoided. Despite your emphasis on how the Germans venerated Rome, which I agree with, I cannot help but to think that some secluded pre-migration Vandal would have thought the same in respect to Rome. Well, for that matter, also some Romans thought that in respect to Rome. So yes, and definitely sort of the more you belong to the French, and the more you had that idea. We'll explain now how and why. Though, you say, we both know that in the end civilization triumphed. So why did the Gökturks express such a distaste for China in comparison to other barbarians who were typically lured into assimilation? So, okay, so let's first of all end this. I understand the later Turks would eventually repeat the cycle of cultural domination/adoption, but the Gökturks are fascinatingly the first barbarians that I read about who demonstrate an avulsion to civilization. In contrast, the Khitans and Uyghurs seem to have created a hybrid steppe empire with strong Chinese-Iranian influences. So what caused these steppe empires to embrace or reject Chinese culture? So, first of all, also the Gökturks, of course, had important Chinese and Iranian influences, right? That's not something that you could really control. It's like, I don't know, when today you look at certain powers that despise the West, but they're actually a westernized reality, or even a Western reality themselves. I mean, think about India, think about Russia, depending on the variation, or even China is a communist country on the basis of European scholars. So it's something that you can obviously see in different degrees, right? The reason why the Gökturks would express this idea about China is quite interesting in my opinion. First of all, the era, the context is important. From a geographical point of view, you know that the Gökturks, regardless of the fact that eventually split up in two, so they had similar problems to all the other steppe empires, were actually pretty big and powerful, right, to a degree that encompassed an enormous amount of land and peoples. And so they lorded over a significant amount of peoples in turn to represent themselves as some sort of other imperial force, right? For example, in the previous videos we talked about the Bulgars that surely had a countercultural opinion regarding the empire and its costumes and its centralization, etc., but ended up asking, especially at the top level, for the imperial title. The Göktürks wouldn't simply do that. It is true, but they also were a people that lorded over a more exhausted steppe in a time where, let's say, geographical limits were sort of difficult to simply bypass. It's true that the steppes peoples could install themselves, as if it had just happened during the migration era, in so many different basins and ruling over them. But at the same time, we're also looking at peoples that, in relative terms to China, they would be fragmented at some point, or at least not as strong as before, also against the same Turks, could look weaker, right? And the Göktürks, again, regardless of their strategic projection, logistical feats that nomads always did, were, in that sense, probably just not able to even think to take over China in order to represent themselves in any other way but something that would actually act in comparison to it as some superior reality. Because probably they felt up to it, they felt better than it, right? So, for example, in Europe with the Germans, you don't really see that, right? It's different because Europeans are still Europeans, regardless of the ethnic divides that we have. What's the distance between Rome and Germany? There are just the Alps in between, and they have always been crossed for millennia, right? And you can argue with, as I just said, with Asia, nomadic movements had been of that kind, but here we're talking about much vaster expanses of land, and probably also very different, not just ethnicities, but probably lifestyles that would, in the case of a bit more civilized steppes empires, like at this point, ones that had enough surplus to represent themselves in certain terms, to be spiteful towards that specific Chinese civilization that, however, still heavily informed them, and evidently they envied, they had negative ideas for some reason, right? When the Romans took over Alexander's conquered territories, they had a great estimate towards that. The Germans in many ways. So it's really a matter of proximity, and perhaps also a vision of, say, like the world has been crumbling, like the strong, mighty Chinese empire is not quite the same as before, even though they're still powerful and dangerous. So this feels like our moments, like the biggest empire in the steppes ever created, right? And so they had reasons to boast this. Then, on another note, the Manchu dynasty also seemed to have difficulty maintaining peace with the dominant Han. Given the various foreign dynasties that ruled China, how integral was Hanness to imperial rule? How was Manchu and Han identity perceived? In the Ming dynasty, who was the peasant and who was the barbarian? Did 19th century nationalism have an impact on an anti-Manchu sentiment in the Ming dynasty? Well, surely these things come about. It's a bit like the contempt towards certain, perceivedly rotten and dysfunctional ancien regime realities, up to, think about the Central Empire, say, I don't know, and beyond, like Prussia, Austria, Russia, Turkey, right, in World War One. Certain deficits eventually play a role, especially when the, say, values and, say, the virtue that undertaking, like embarking oneself in the notion of a universal polity, regardless of the shortcomings of the same polities, even foundationally speaking in some cases, especially by that point, would bring to such a dissolution. The same goes for China, right? It's a bit it's not just nationalism, it's also socialism. This is a widespread Actually, they can be both nationalist and socialist at the same time, as it often happened, right? Communist was often very nationalistic, and in general, this was compounded, in fact, with social issues, right? As far as China was concerned, my impression was always that the Mongol dynasties were, say, just be too much into the broader Chinese imperial traditional essence, not to say to be simply ousted, to have necessarily much of an issue with the Han identity per se. If anything, they had conquered them, they had taken them over fair and square, and in the sense, the Han element is more like the national one than the dynastic one that was called to rule it, right? So there would be a tension between the two, but it would not necessarily be more violent, as actually the longevity of such, the general success of such dynasties would prove compared to more tormented times in Chinese history, when where the local dynasties were actually Han, but also they didn't have the full control in the system. Naturally, in different times when civilization was more shattered and more etc. But China is also very big within itself, and so there are likely dynamics that, especially in the West, we tend not to see. Persia. So at the end of this trio, we come full circle with the originary topic. So Persia here, parenthesis, Greeks, Parni, Arabs, Turks, Mongols. Wow. As I have not exhausted this topic enough, I would like to once again bring the Persians into our discussion. Great, let's do this. I like the attitude. This time, however, I wish to look beyond the Achaemenid dynasty. Okay. The Persians appear to have been ruled by many foreigners, yet for some reason their culture persists. And I must stress into the modern day. It should be no surprise that tribal nomads such as the Parni and Turks were subsumed into Persian culture. But how did the Persians manage to resist Hellenism? How did the Mongols in all their might fail to Mongolize Persia or any other polity by that matter, right? So before we go on, the answer is pretty straightforward. So Hellenism does not mean Hellenization. You know that in Alexander's empire there's a coexistence of different cultures, the Persian one being arguably the most prominent in Asia, and the certain path of Hellenization, of course, to a degree intended as. It's not like the Persians became Greeks, but some Greeks that also inhabited, by the way, the Achaemenid Empire before Alexander, and they were not happy, by the way, that the Macedons had come about, among the other things, which also led to the secession of Bactria on the basis of those Cretan colonists that the Achaemenids had settled centuries before in that northeastern frontier. That Hellenic element had become just, founding certain cities, having certain Greeks ruling them, and obviously not being able to eliminate, like in Egypt, for example, this is the same thing, Egyptian culture. All right, you can argue that Egypt sort of course, eventually lost its identity because it became an Arab country. Fair. And also they are Arab in our sense of Arab countries. It's not like, for example, ethnically speaking, the Egyptians are Arab at large, right? If anything, they speak Arab. Persia remains what it remains. And this happens really, as it often happens, as it's rare to really find major ethnic shifts just because of a single conquest that is also not particularly prolonged over time. In fact, yes, the Seleucid rule over Persia lasted for a century and something, almost a couple of centuries. But Persia was not the center of the Seleucid Empire. It was a decentralized province. It was pretty big, pretty difficult to simply access, to colonize. It was full of Persians, which is mostly the reason why the Persians managed to resist Hellenism. And for this reason, also fuel. This is often a secondary aspect. It kept being fueled by other Iranians who were subsumed demographically to the Persian, to the Farsi hegemony, including the Parthy, for example. So you continue and say, how did the Mongols, in all their might, fail to Mongolize Persia or any other polity by that matter? Actually, even more simply, like they just like it didn't manage to Mongolize China or to Mongolize practically any other place but Mongolia, to be honest, because also like other Khanates were mostly just Turkic, like they floated on the basis of like the Mongol empires. I wouldn't say it's overrated, but it didn't really leave this enormous, let's say it was so rapid, right, that and this is typical of steppes, cultural, at least there is an increasing pattern in steppes history, that certain conquests are ever bigger, but they're carried out by ever sort of more primitive peoples that also do not quite start developing a culture of its own in the steppe, in a sort of more civilized sense. Some had tried. The Indo-Europeans had started feudalizing. Even, I don't know, the Khazars had started doing the same thing with massive fortifications, etc. These other waves were ever wilder to an extent, and so there is no doubt that the Mongols were a might to be reckoned with, but why would they Mongolize Persia after all? They just occupied it with some essentially military garrisons, and the entire country was Persian and way more civilly advanced than these nomads living in tents somewhere in Central Asia. So it's not really, or actually in Northeastern Asia, but you get the point of it. Surely Alexander did more to leave an Hellenic legacy in Persia than did the Mongols did with a Mongol legacy in the Ilkhanate, right? Then you go on, says, one would think they would be an exception to the usual tribal steppe confederacy, that they would manage to build a culture worth spreading. More importantly, I'm trying to understand the meaning of this, because one would think there would be an exception to the usual tribal steppe confederacy, that they would manage to build a culture worth spreading. More importantly, how were they able to resist the tide of Arabization, which now dominates the Middle East and North Africa? Well, this is also the point, that the Iranians had always been heavily separated from the Semites. So Arabs on Arabs, basically that happens. Egypt is more accessible. Probably the Arabs really worked to Arabize, at least in a sense of elite. That again is something also very much chosen at some point. It can spread to other abodes, especially if you're fighting against another great empire just across the sea, like the Byzantine one. All right. You can argue that, I don't know, not even Arab Spain ever simply spoke Arab, right? And this has to do with different demographic pools that are involved. Indeed, Egypt at that point is one side, and it may have to do with the fact that it was the hottest bed of heresy, right? The Egyptians of all the Levantines were the ones who opened more directly the gates to the Arabs during the Islamic conquests, right? There was also maybe some kind of greater proximity of the Egyptian world to the Semitic one, and or at least to a certain lifestyle that was seen as that point, like the Bedouins, the rampant one of the conquerors. Islam was also pretty totalizing as far as the language of the Quran is concerned, so that is also very important, right? As if this language came to be inherently crammed into any form of administration in states ruled by the Sharia, which is very different, say, from the Bible, for example. And for reasons that are specifically connected with Arab, with Islamic theology, in part also deriving from Arab lifestyle. Today we do not simply digress on, because at this point we're talking about Persia basically. There's a pretty steep divide between Persian culture as Iranians and essentially the other Semite cousins, almost brothers, that the Arabs had always been next door to, routinely launching raids and already being there, like expanding into the empire. But to some extent, what's the difference between Syrians and Arabs? Of course, there are important differences, but when you look at the ethnic backbone, aside from different other cultures, minorities scattered all around, etc., like the Semitic sort of divide is Semitic actual cohesion instead is often overlooked in that picture. We need to think of the Arabs as others ethnically compared to Mesopotamia. That's not quite the thing. So going on, what is about the potency of Persian culture that allowed it to persist into the modern day? Why did so many cultures fail to supplant Persian identity? So again, as I said before, huge territory, difficult to access, strongly reinvigorated by an Iranian fuel coming from the steppes that mingles into the essentially feudal establishment that is capable of, in fact, perpetually revitalizing itself also against any Persian monarchy. The Romans destroyed Persia multiple times, but it's not like they destroyed the Persians, all right, in ethnic terms. Nobody could simply arrive in Persia and starting colonizing, bringing people from more civilized places, and equally from the wilder ones, having the demographic strength to supplant the Persians. But this is basically it, right? Persia is a very old culture. It's very much shaded in many ways. It's not always even just a simple civilization, a fully fledged one throughout ancient and medieval times, because it's differently distributed and it has especially feudal characters, not quite startling kind. The Achaemenids also mostly rule over more civilized peoples like the aforementioned Babylonians, for example. But they maintain, in fact, their sort of imperial, military, feudal lifestyle that helps them, a bit like, I don't know, you could say the French kingdom at some point rise in spite of the, of any monarchic capacity to expand the control in the world territory. You could also ask, however, like, why did, I don't know, Persia remain Persia, why Anatolia became Turk? Right, that's an interesting question as well, that I don't want to put myself in trouble by myself. You can argue that Anatolia had never been fully homogeneous. There had been so many different cultures in it that were very often more Indo-European at times than even something different. And exhaustion, as we've seen, does play a role, but also the necessity of a more gluing factor and capacity that can give stability to a local government can be championed as a new identity, right? And without even necessarily supplanting the local one. We're also looking at differently populated countries, all right? Even though the Mashrek more or less follows similar patterns. Persia is just, in a sense, there's, as you know, many areas that are depopulated. The population is concentrated just in some parts, because the rest, it's enormous. Some parts are deserts and parts are mountains, right? So it's complicated, but at large, you can find also for this reason different spaces for different peoples, including those Iranian war bands that you can routinely settle here and there, right? That remain a bit the backbone of the system. The fact that the Achaemenids also had existed is quite important, I would say. Like the fact that the Achaemenids were the universal empire, and now we will get to that point in the question as well. That legacy was worth reviving in ways that were absolutely worthy, right? Legitimate in terms of wanting to emulate the civilization. And because, of course, there was a lot in common with the Iranian dynasties that came about, even from outside of Persia, to rule it. religiously, ethno-linguistically, etc. So that's also quite important. So you say, finally, it is clear that during the Byzantine era, the Romans were willing to acknowledge the Persians as a civilizational sphere of their own. I don't think people grasp the gravity of this idea. The Romans, who regarded themselves as civilization itself, finally recognized another ecumenical sphere of influence. Interestingly, the Caliphate would have no problem in obtaining this recognition as well. True. In fact, I would have also digressed myself on that, but I digress, you say. Did the Romans of antiquity also feel the same way about the Parthian and Sassanid empires? Was Rome of antiquity willing to acknowledge Persia was an ecumenical sphere of its own, and if not, did the Romans exalt Persians over other barbarian peoples? As you pointed out, this seems to have happened in the Byzantine era. So we shouldn't simply think that the Romans originally had an idea that Persia was an ecumenic power on its own. Naturally, the Romans knew that China existed, they knew that Persia existed, they knew that India existed, for example, and they acknowledged, of course, the relative unknown connected to the notions as far as they received them. The Romans traveled to China. They knew what it was about, but they had less representative means that would exist, for example, also in the Middle Ages. Also, economy was importantly different. It was not really a mercantilistic one, as it would, in fact, become a millennium later in a more pronounced way, etc. We probably estimate the width of Roman reach, really, everywhere in the world. But of course, antiquity had inherent limits, right? We tend often to magnify them, but you can actually even go beyond what we conventionally know in thinking about the stretch of this power, but not much in its potential. That's a mistake that, in my opinion, is often done. It's obvious that in the moment in which the Byzantine Empire was reduced to an essentially Hellenic dimension, they controlled, maybe after Justinian's reconquest, Italy, parts of, like we see, Africa, even Spain, but they were fundamentally reduced to what had been the eastern half of the empire in the earlier days. They would become comparatively of the same size of the Persians. So your question is very perceptive, and it is in fact a big deal that the Romans had to cope, if anything, with the Persians in ways that were obviously a struggle between two major cosmic powers, almost incarnating a dualistic heresy. In fact, it was full of Gnostics all around in that time, which did not favor Persia, which was the inferior culture between the two, by the way, not just because Constantinople destroyed the Sasanian Empire, but also because, in fact, the Byzantines had simply a greater statal resilience compared to many of the powers that came to statally, politically form, even in Persia after the Islamic conquest, etc. You can argue that the Byzantines recognized eventually also not just the caliphates, as of course a neighbor provided with an important level of power, but they never fully recognized the fact that they were at their level, all right? Even the Bulgarians did so, but think about Charlemagne, right? And the Carolingian Empire was really something big. They had de facto stripped them of Rome herself. So there is a lot to say about this, but we do not straightforwardly see the Romans recognizing a peerage level to others, if not instrumentally, opportunistically, just to negotiate, to mediate, all right? This is very important. The Romans did not accept but their own universality of power, right? The Byzantines did so. I mean, especially they stuck, since there were other that were properly claiming the Roman title for themselves, mostly to a juristic and statalistic notion, as the direct continuity of the Roman government and administration. In interest of time, we should be, in geography, say, at least from one side of the empire, we should be considered as just the only Romans. Of course, the original notion of the empire in the past was not that, right? And even probably they didn't conceive the state, as I'm also often making the point about themselves. Even less they considered an Islamic power, something of that kind. It's true that during, the iconoclasm, we see there also an influence of the Islamic appeal, also amongst certain, especially the Eastern Byzantine populations, as it had happened. In fact, for those who had already been lost before, that put in crisis the empire, they decided to recur to some sort of aniconism, just like in the Islamic tradition. There was a greater sense of totalization, of a sole god, of like the absence of sort of less transcendental references to, again, it was mostly a Byzantine problem. And so at that point, I wouldn't even say that it's necessarily Rome. Rome never had equals in Western Eurasia. In fact, the same caliphates, the same Persian, at the end of the day, where did they go? Right? The only who succeeded in creating something that could truly rival with the West at some point, it ain't that, probably with much less chances than we think, were the Ottomans. And even there, that they were half Westerner themselves, right? So it's very different. In fact, they would have considered the same Persians themselves as something very different and inferior to them, even if they were the literal heirs to Constantinople, right? Did Rome ever exalt the Persians over other barbarian peoples? Well, Byzantine culture in general recognized how advanced the Persians were in many circumstances. There was obviously a knowledge and awareness that Persia was yet another big civilization. Yes. Did this take, like, again, the character of a cosmic struggle on? Yeah, absolutely. Between two almost equal powers. If you look, in theory, just the map, yes. Yet, first of all, somebody won there, and Rome had always had the upper hand, also before. So, again, it's debatable because that sense of ecumenism by the migration era had been shattered pretty much everywhere, right? And even the same rise of the Sasanian Empire is more like a consequence of the crisis of Rome to some extent than actually the overpower of some Persian civilization reborn at that point, right? There are literal connections where we often forget, for that matter, not just how much the Byzantines were Persified in culture, at the court, in diplomacy, even in fashion, etc., but how much the Persians had been Romanized, and before also Hellenized. So the Western Eurasia was always perceived as gravitating around Europe and the European Empire, at least since Alexander, all right? So throughout all, with Rome and even whoever the Europeans were, they had such a solid Roman legacy that paradoxically it's been the Westerners to sort of not deny, but to basically forget because of the achievement of the nation states, of the modern states, whatever you want to call them, that thus became the individual different protagonists also in a particular historiographical interpretation of history. But we often don't see how much of Rome there was even before Charlemagne among the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, in the awareness of the original meaning of the same imperium. So this is it. Now that you have reached the end, I must give thanks for your patience and enthusiasm on these subjects. I'm sure you don't always respond to every question, So I'm flattered by your willingness to discuss these mysteries which have laid so heavily on my heart. I also hope my personal introduction quenched your curiosity for why I asked these questions. Yeah, I would say so. Not entirely. I mean, maybe the thing of the French, maybe that's so where you have a Southeast Asian, Laotian, Vietnamese background. It might have to do with the French connection that we debated before, but I'm not really sure about that. Because a branch of your people is like in French Guinea as well. They were, in the sense, also as a community over there, a product of colonial movements. So it is a mix of my religiosity, ethnicity, historical enthusiasm, and current day affairs which have led to wonder such things. Well, and I think it's great. I mean, if you really like history so much, I would even suggest, since you're young enough, by the way, that you can easily start studying history in a serious way. I know doctors that were older than that when I studied at university who were literally like these were people working at the hospital. They had private practice, but they went with us youngsters literally taking a degree in history. I don't know if they ever have, but there were more than once engineers as well. I mean, just to say that you can have a profession and cultivate another even to a profitable and proficient degree if you really have a dedication, etc. And history is that fascinating. You can play with it in this fashion. That's also why I make the Q&A. I think it's really a unique chance to have these talks, because I also would never really talk, at least in these random terms, with anyone about history. So, yeah, I often look to myself as someone born in the US and wonder how would a Celt and Anglo-Saxon, both being peasants, have received one another? How would a Balkan Slav see themselves as a Bulgarian? I'm happy to say I have lived a good life in the country I was born in and faced little animosity from people of all backgrounds. These are the powers of the West. They don't last, say, forever in specific historical context, but definitely the United States achieved something that is really remarkable. Also against some, at least more natural or at least a more conventional trend that tends to produce itself. Maybe is in action, but unfortunately, to some degree, but that in some sense was defied. Perhaps my experience assimilating into American culture has at least some parallel to our ancestors, minus the killing, raping, and enslavement, of course. I always insert the triad every time. Here, I want to point out how, indeed, this was pretty much universal, as much as the imperial Catholic tradition in different levels of this. So, again, thank you for these questions. I had fun answering them. Of course, if in the future have anything like, now let's let a bit of time pass, maybe, because there are specific realities. We covered a lot of stuff, but naturally these are endless topics. Like there can be surely other questions and answers. But for now, let's say it was really, the first time I covered in such depth such requests in a row, especially because they were all intertwined and they sort of revolved around the same important point. So it seemed like a good chance to explore this topic on Schwerpunkt. So regards, a fan. And so we have done this. Okay, I have some queue actually with questions also from people who asked me stuff several months ago, still have to answer. I can't answer everyone actually, but we are getting very good questions, and so that's mostly the basis that brings me to eventually make these videos, regardless of any other also strategy that I have going. I know that people watch the series quite often, or at least the playlist for some reason. So it may be a strategy also for the channel to grow, and it's a way to show that Schwerpunkt does interact with the audience, and that this can hopefully attract more traffic. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.